start with what's going on in Washington. You were there over the weekend to vote on several bills. How did all of that go?
Well, I think in the end, I think we all should be proud of the achievement. I think that the difficulty was in the 3 or 4 months that led up to the Saturday actual vote. I think a lot of this could have been resolved earlier on with some good sense. I do think that the Republican Party's in a bit of a civil war with themselves. And I think that the difficulty is that even though it passed by a lopsided measure, the question as to whether or not the Speaker was even going to bring it up was in doubt until about a week ago. And the Speaker of the House controls legislation. So I think that there was a bit of a battle within his own party. And I think in the end, what was interesting about the Ukraine aid, every Democrat in the House voted for it. Less than half the Republicans in the House voted for it. So I think in that sense, the Speaker did the right thing.
So you voted yes for Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific bill. Why did you vote yes on all those?
Well, because I think in Ukraine, they've been gallant. And I think that they have fought against long odds. I think when Russia, with a brutal dictator, decided to invade Ukraine, I don't think anybody would have suggested that Ukraine would have even lasted this long. And it looks as though with this assistance, coupled with NATO, which is a big contributor, that I think that the stalemate can be reversed. And I hope and anticipate that in the end, Ukraine will prevail. In the Middle East, remember that part of that money that was going to Israel was also for the purpose of humanitarian aid to Gaza. So I think that there was a combination of events, and we cannot miss or understate the threat of China in the Indo-Pacific region, and coming to the aid of Taiwan is very important. China is using leverage everywhere across Southeast Asia, and I think that we need to be mindful of it, so I think supporting Taiwan. These, by the way, are traditional Democrat-Republican positions that would have not been uncommon in the Reagan years, in the Bush years, the Clinton years, or the Obama years. These would have been what we would have seen as our obligation to NATO, which in the rearview mirror looks pretty good right now.
That sort of brings up my next question. There does seem to be a lot of drama in Washington right now. You brought up Speaker Johnson. You know, he makes a decision, people threaten to take away his position. Is this just how it's going to be from here on out?
I think it is. I think it's going to be very tenuous for him, given the fact that they now have a 1-seat majority in the House. So the difficulty for them is going to be they're going to have to depend on a lot of Democratic votes. So I don't anticipate a lot of big legislation before the election, which is now about 6.5 months away. But I think that what's important to remember here is that there were a series of miscalculations that were made, including offering some protection to a speaker. And when the former Speaker, McCarthy, decided that he was going to allow a rump group in the House to be able to vacate the chair based on one petition, I mean, the consequence of that is pretty far-reaching, not the least of which is that any member of the House now can challenge the Speaker of the House to take away their job. My suggestion is that you need a 50 or 70 vote majority because, candidly, Speakers of the House often have to do 2 things. They have to bring forward legislation that a lot of members might not want to vote on, and other times to force them to vote on things that they might not want to vote on. So I think that the Speaker's job is very controversial. They're the conductor of the orchestra inside of the institution, and I think that some element of protection for a Speaker of the House in terms of addressing popular emotions is important.
That would protect this small minority from being able to take him out of that
That's
position.
Exactly right. I mean, the idea that one person, I walked over with a young Republican not long ago to vote, he's a very nice guy, and I said to him, I said, the first thing you need to do is change that rule. And he said to me, it takes away my power, which astounded me because that means that you're not going to have collective action, which in the end is what the representative democracy calls for.
Could that change happen soon? Is there any possibility?
I don't see it. I think that the Speaker intended to try something, and again, that same group stepped forward, and they said that they would vote in totality to take him out. So on our side, I think we had a very strong Speaker in Nancy Pelosi and a very measured, I think, agreement within the House that there was no threat to her speakership.
For people who are seeing this at home, the average family, and they're seeing all of this going on in Washington, what do you want them to know?
Well, I think part of it is representative democracy at work. I think that from the framing of our constitutional system until the moment, I mean, it's very difficult to second guess the people who voted for these individuals. And I might take the position, I don't know how so-and-so got elected, but I do have to accept the reality that they did get elected. I think, Taylor, that the primary system is having an undue influence on this now. We all thought that the computer would allow a better reflection of American interest with the drawing of congressional districts. The problem is that many of these congressional districts are now drawn in blue lanes or red lanes, and the outcome is that people that can win a primary with a small number of votes then are not challenged in a general election. The result of which is that oftentimes the most outlandish character gets elected.
So switching gears to immigration here, this is obviously an issue that's impacting Massachusetts. Governor Healy has called on the federal government many times to make changes. What changes do you support when it comes to immigration reform?
Well, I think on the immigration front, we always have to be mindful of our history, that immigration is and will be very important to our economic system, as well as to, I think, the orchestra of America. And at the same time, I think you need a process. I do not favor open borders. You need to know who's in the country and how they come into the country and get access. And I think that there was a time when, as we've just discussed, that reasonable minds would have come to a conclusion. I mean, American birth rates are changing dramatically. There's a downward pressure. And for an economy to grow, you need a certain new element of investment that comes with larger participation. So I think in that sense, the meatpacking houses across the Midwest have been transformed because of immigration. The problem is much of it's undocumented. And so it's estimated that there are anywhere from 11 to 12 million undocumented people in America. I think when I hear this hyperbolic statement from the former president that he's going to round them all up and send them back, I don't think anybody really believes that's possible. But at the same time, we need to get them to come out of the shadows of American life. Register and get in line so that we know who you are. And you know, the Social Security system is going to depend upon them. And when you consider that they now pay anywhere from $8 to $10 billion a year in Social Security benefits that they're never going to draw because they use false identities. And I think that there's a lot of the argument about immigration that needs a better tuning.
So is there any chance, before November, that any immigration reform can get anywhere?
Unlikely. And I think that part of it is the reflection of the election season that we're in. The former president, as you know, has taken a very hard line against immigration, and the result of which it'll be very hard to get past that, I think.
So locally, you were in Springfield yesterday talking about the West-East Rail. Tell me about that.
Well, I think it's very exciting. I think that when I was a very young man, and I used to participate in get-togethers of business leaders, Chamber of Commerce types, and labor union types, they would often refer to Springfield as the crossroads of New England because geographically it's the center of New England. And the refurbishment of Union Station, which I worked on for a long period of time, now I think enhances that opportunity because the north-south rail is working quite well. In fact, we're ahead of where we were even before COVID. And now I think east-west is really important. I think that you can suggest it could be west-east, east-west, but making Springfield the center of New England transportation and being much more accommodating for what rail is going to mean in the future, I think it's important. And that improvement physically is going to start between Worcester and Boston by next spring. And on the other side of it, I'm committed to the idea of taking rail from Springfield to Pittsfield and on to Albany. So the Valley Flyer is working well, north-south is working well, and we need to improve east-west.
What do you hope for the future?
Well, I'd like to see at least 4 or 5 trains a day back and forth. I mean, you can jump on that train now and be in New Haven in about an hour and 20 minutes, hour and 10 minutes or so. So I think that makes a substantial difference. And if you're on your way to New York City, it's a pretty nice way to travel.
Some people are saying this is never going to happen. I'll be dead when it happens. What do you have to say to them?
That's what they said about Union Station.
So you believe in this project?
Well, the money's there. I mean, that's the other argument. I think that, over the years I've heard these arguments, and now then you get to participate in it, it will never happen moments. So I think that the reasonable position was, well, where's the money going to come from? Well, the infrastructure bill, of which I played an instrumental role, it's going to provide north of $9 billion to the state of Massachusetts. And let me say this, since you asked a great question. We don't want this money just going to the MBTA, which we know is going to require a huge investment. We already pay a cent on the sales tax for that. the MBTA. Our constituents don't exercise that opportunity to use the MBTA. So I want a corresponding effort from Boston to central and western Massachusetts, and also the grim reminder of what happened with the Big Dig. So Boston-centric people, I don't think a lot of what happens out here occurs to them. I don't think it's malicious. I just don't think they think of it. And they feel that the MBTA is their transportation system. I think it needs to be much larger, and Governor Healy has been very receptive to my arguments.
Another thing here in Western Massachusetts was the hospital in North Adams reopening.
Yeah.
That was really important for that area.
Yeah, it's great. I was able to change some of the language, and went on for 3 or 4 years, and I thought it was really neat that on the 10th anniversary of it closing, we reopened it. And we were able to change language in terms of actually what winter's like in the Berkshires, how traveling from Northampton to Pittsfield, from North Adams to Pittsfield would be very difficult during the winter months. So that was a really important consideration, and I was pretty patient with it. It helps that the woman who runs CMS used to work for me, and if you go to that hospital, wow, is the community pretty happy.
So that is obviously a rural community problem. Are there any other rural community problems specifically here in Western Massachusetts that you're hearing about, things that you're working on?
Yes, I actually think that rural health care is a big challenge. We came out of the COVID with a number of new experiments that I think were really important, but I think we hopefully learned some lessons as well. And I think that there are a lot of people who are nearly shut in some of these rural towns, maybe on the Vermont border, in some of the hill towns. The elderly in particular. So I think that telehealth is going to be with us for the future. I think that was a very important accommodation. But I also think that the challenge with healthcare is that insurance is based on risk. And insurance is essentially sharing risk. So I have always been for universal access. But the economics have to work. And I think that in some of our rural communities, it's just harder. The idea of the neighborhood pediatrician, that's kind of quaint now. And I think part of it is that it's the pressure of economics in terms of where your office has to be located and how many people you have to see a day. It's no longer the country doctor coming through to take care of you and your family.
So speaking of insurance and some risks, this is something we've talked about before, the crumbling concrete issue here in western central Massachusetts. What can the federal government do to help these homeowners? There's still no state legislation passed.
Yeah, well, the federal government stepped forward pretty quickly on this. I talked about the issue with Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, the former Secretary of the Treasury. I talked to him specifically, and he gave us some room in some of the language that they were able to put together, and these people have a reasonable complaint, so I hope that the state is willing to step forward. Connecticut has stepped forward, and they've been coming to the assistance of people who are in a situation where they cannot sell the home for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which they're not going to find a buyer because the buyer doesn't want to take on the legacy costs of what's happening with crumbling foundations. So I agree with them. I've met with the families, and the federal government wants to be of assistance.
Any plans for re-election at this point?
Well, I mean, I'm a candidate. I certainly enjoy what I'm doing. I've had a great opportunity over a long period of time, and apparently the voters have agreed with much of what I've had to say because this has been a pretty good run.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I think there's a lot of exciting news that's coming, and if I could just talk upon, I don't think that there's been enough attention devoted to many of these Washington achievements that we've had. I understand people cover the conflict of it. But when you stop and think of the CARES Act, it saved the American economy. And then we're around to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the biggest investment in climate change in the history of the world. The infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the multi-employer pension legislation. A lot of this has flown under the radar screen largely because of the conflict all of the time. And I think as changes have taken place in mainstream media, it's harder to cover the context of some of these stories, and so there's more devotion to the conflict in the story. And the challenge with that is these are substantial achievements, and I want to say that during my 4 years as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, we wrote most of that legislation, if not overwhelmingly that legislation. And the American economy is the envy of the rest of the world.